Welcome to CARICOM Matters. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for joining us. During the July-August period of 2022, a number of experts drawn from civil society and academia converged on Barbados at the invitation of government to explore the prospects for the overhaul of the international financial system, as well as solutions to the challenges facing humanity. The product of this is the Bridgetown Agenda, the charter which Prime Minister Motley alluded to during her addresses at the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly and the Kofi Annan Lecture Series. It is a collection of ideas to reform multilateral financial organizations like the World Bank and IMF. Ambassador David Comissiong provides his perspective on the origins of the initiative.
The Bridgetown initiative came about because a number of outstanding academics and activists were invited to come to Barbados around the end of July, going into August, invited by the government of Barbados to brainstorm the very serious existential crisis situation that the world finds itself in, and that developing countries in particular find themselves in. So we know the crisis. The climate crisis, the shutdown of the world economy that was caused by the pandemic and that then resulted in disruption in global supply chains, galloping inflation, cost of living crisis, and a very serious debt crisis that those events have caused for many developing countries. In fact, when these folk met in Barbados to discuss, back then 1 in 4 countries was under very serious financial and debt stress, and it has only gotten worse since then. 1 in 5 back then, now it's 1 in 4, so it's even gotten worse. So that was the environment in which these folk came together and put together this package of solutions, demands, that has come to be known as the Bridgetown Initiative. The Bridgetown Initiative because it was put together in Bridgetown, Barbados, but Barbados is not claiming it. It's not a Barbados initiative. This is a coalition of ideas from a wide range of thinkers and activists, but they have been brought together and they have been dovetailed to provide one interlocking, coherent plan of action.
So we have this plan of action, but what's the rationale behind it? One of the main ideas advanced in the agenda is that multilateral institutions, especially those established in the immediate post-World War II period, require reform.
Well, that's where the Bridgetown Initiative starts, because the basic premise is that the currently existing international financial institutions, principally the IMF and the World Bank group of institutions, the major multilateral development banks that are closely associated with the World Bank and the IMF, that these institutions, for the most part, were developed around 1945, many years ago. And they were developed at a time when the world looked very different from how it looks today. Back then in 1945, at the time of the so-called Bretton Woods Conference that produced these institutions, there were 51 independent countries in the world. And these countries would mostly have been European countries, North American countries, and of course some countries from Latin America. The whole of Africa was still colonized, the Caribbean was still colonized, most of Asia was still colonized. So you will find that the institutions that were born in that particular international environment were configured really to deal with that world of 51 independent nations, and to deal with the developmental challenges of that era. Fast forward, what, 70-something years later, we now have 195 independent nations. The other 144, basically developing countries, former colonies. We now have, the world now faces existential challenges on a scale much more massive than what we faced back then. For example, global warming, the climate crisis. To deal with global warming, it is going to call for massive resources on a scale probably not imaginable back in 1945. Then there are the developmental challenges of the 144 developing countries that have come on the scene, requiring investment capital on a much more massive scale than would have been the thinking back in, let's say, 1945. Then we have the recent example of the pandemic, where we have learnt that a virus that starts in one country of the world can shut down the entire world economy. So it is telling us that, for example, that a global public health system is a must in the world of the 21st century. So the Bridgetown Initiative begins with that understanding that these institutions that were born in the 20th century now have to be brought into the 21st century. They have to be revamped. What you will find is that because they were born at a time when Africa and the Caribbean were all colonized, you will find that there's not much of an African or Caribbean or black or brown presence or influence in these institutions. So, for example, the head of the IMF is always a French person. The head of the World Bank is always a citizen of the United States of America. There's no black country, black or brown country, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and we can go on and on. So clearly, in this 21st century, these institutions need to be reconfigured, where black and brown countries and people must be given their rightful place. The G20 is a kind of informal governance committee of the world. How can you have an informal governance committee of the world that does not include the 1.4 billion people of the African continent and the 54 nation states of the African continent? So why shouldn't the African Union be part of, why shouldn't it be a G21 with the African Union included? So it begins by demanding a revamping of these institutions to bring them into the 21st century. But it also goes on to look at the functions of these institutions, the priorities of these institutions. And it is saying that these priorities need to change. These priorities that these institutions need to be pursuing are the current day priorities of 2022. And at the elevated scale, the much more massive scale that is now required in 2022.
Ambassador Comissiong continues to elaborate on the dire importance of the agenda.
The Bridgetown Initiative is offering a solution to the critical existential problems facing developing countries, including those of CARICOM. So, as we know, the pandemic hit the Caribbean hard, real hard. In fact, because we are the world's most tourism and travel dependent region, we were hit harder than any other region. I mean, Barbados, in the first year of the pandemic, our economy collapsed by about 20%. So virtually every CARICOM country is in a situation of serious debt stress. Even if we don't want to say debt crisis, we can concede that we're in a situation of serious debt stress. All of us had to take on unexpected debt. All of our governments had to take on unexpected debts to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the Bridgetown initiative is offering us a way out of that debt stress or that debt crisis situation. Maybe we will go into what the specific solutions being proposed by the Bridgetown initiative are. But that is one aspect of it. Also, we are on the front line of the climate crisis. we are facing every year increasingly violent hurricanes, sargassum seaweed, droughts, water shortages, freak storms, you name it. And the Bridgetown initiative also addresses the climate crisis and the assistance, the critical assistance that the world community and the international institutions of the world community must give to countries like those of the Caribbean. So this Bridgetown initiative, in fact, we could probably even refer to it as a CARICOM initiative. I mean, it is so central to the needs of CARICOM countries. And because the scholars and activists came to Barbados and put the thing together here, I guess we have a special responsibility to take it forward and outwards to the rest of the world. And of course, we will begin with CARICOM. Beyond CARICOM, CILAT, Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, across the Atlantic, the African Union, Commonwealth. It is now up to us to take this Bridgetown initiative all over the world and get as many governments, scholars, leaders, opinion shapers to buy into it and to support it.
In order to build that support, stakeholders have begun advocating on the world stage.
I think the first phase of making it known would have started with Prime Minister Motley and her speech at the United Nations General Assembly in September. And I think that is when the world would first have heard about the Bridgetown initiative. Then she subsequently spoke at the Kofi Annan lecture, and she went into it in even greater detail. I have made the effort to do a major newspaper article about it that was sent out, well, certainly regionally. It's been published in several locations in the Caribbean. And that article has been translated into both French and Spanish. And I'm trying to get it translated into Dutch as well. So I think that we all have to make the effort to get it out there. My remit is CARICOM, so I will be focusing very much on the Caribbean community, public education within the Caribbean community. But I would imagine that soon from now, Barbados will probably formally place it on the agenda of CARICOM, whether it's at the level of a heads of government meeting or a meeting of foreign ministers, and invite CARICOM to develop a program, a CARICOM program of international diplomacy and activism around it. So still a lot of work to be done.
Now, the Bridgetown agenda is reportedly comprised of three main components. The first of which deals with the provision of emergency-ready access to financial resources to developing countries.
Yes, well, so the Bridgetown initiative, I mean, it is really targeted at revamping the priorities of the major international financial institutions. But even before it gets to that, it says, look, we have an emergency debt crisis that we have to deal with, even before we get to anything bigger than that. Because as I said, 1 in 4 countries is in a situation of serious debt stress. And of course, developing countries in particular. So it is saying to the international financial institutions, this debt crisis is a direct result, of the pandemic, of the breakdown in global supply chains, of the war in Ukraine, and the all of the inflation that has been unleashed. And if this is not to become a global financial crisis, we need to stop this debt crisis in its tracks now. And so it is proposing to the IMF in particular, is saying to the IMF, look, these developing countries are under stress. You have to come to their assistance. At the height of the pandemic, you were making credit loans available to developing countries. You were not imposing conditions. You were making them available easy and rapidly. You need to go back to that. This crisis isn't over. The pandemic may be petering out, but the crisis is still here, so you need to go back to that. Secondly, you need IMF, you need to suspend interest payments for a period of time for debt-stressed developing countries. Also, a lot of the developing countries need foreign exchange support. Last year, you issued a new round of special drawing rights. Special drawing rights are these IMF assets that are allocated to member countries of the IMF. Basically, what the special drawing right does, it gives the country a claim to hard currencies held by IMF member states at the lowest possible interest rates with no conditions attached. So it is really boosting countries' foreign reserves. So the Bridgetown initiative is saying, of the 650 billion special drawing rights you issued last year, there's at least 100 billion that you issued to wealthy developed countries that they don't need, that they have not used. We are calling on you to reallocate that 100 billion special drawing rights to struggling developing countries who really need the foreign exchange support. And then finally, it is calling on the IMF to this new resilience and sustainability trust that the IMF has developed. It's going to make financing available, especially to developing countries, on very, very long-term and attractive financial terms. Financing that will be going towards building economic and social resilience in our countries. So it is a kind of financing program that developing countries really need. And Barbados has been an advocate for that kind of initiative from the IMF, and it seems as if the IMF listened, and they have established it, and Barbados is slated to be the first beneficiary of it. So what the Bridgetown initiative is saying is, look, you agree to it, you set it up, let it start now. Don't let this month of October pass and it is not operationalized. It is also saying, the Bridgetown initiative is also saying to the G20 countries, the major wealthy countries that are the main shareholders of the multilateral development banks, it is saying to them, look, you need to intervene with the multilateral development banks, and you need to persuade the multilateral development banks to give an easing. The poorest countries that are now struggling with debt, they need to be granted a temporary debt suspension period. And middle-income developing countries that had to take on a whole set of debt to deal with COVID, that COVID-19 debt, middle-income countries like Barbados should also be given a temporary debt suspension period. So the whole idea being to stop this burgeoning debt crisis in its tracks. So that is step one of the Bridgetown initiative.
Yes, so that is the first component. However, to accomplish any of the professed demands, it will require a fair amount of political will and action. Ambassador Comissiong expounds on the commitment of stakeholders.
This is an initiative that the Barbados government is very much committed to. Certainly, Prime Minister Motley, Professor Avinash Prasad. I mean, anybody who reads the Bridgetown initiative can see his fingerprints all over the initiative. So Barbados has a great investment in this initiative. And but as I said, it was not simply designed by Barbadians. So many of the people who came to Barbados to help design it, they too will be, taking action to popularize it. So I think it's all about building a coalition around it, and everybody may not subscribe to every single demand or every single component of the initiative. Some people might see more value in some of the steps rather than others. But the point is, once there is a basic agreement that this set of proposals is moving the world in the right direction, it is targeting critical concerns. So even though we don't agree on every single detail, but we agree that it is aimed at the correct targets, and we all get behind it. Even if we don't achieve the full implementation of it, but if we achieve 1/4 of the implementation of this would do so much for our world community. If we achieve 1/2 of it, we know it is ambitious, but we know any amount of this initiative that we manage to implement, it will be a boon for our world community, and particularly for developing countries. I think so. That's the spirit in which we have to, all hands to the plow, and let us push this as hard as we can, and see how much of this we can actually get implemented.
A call to action to implement the Bridgetown agenda. But what of the other components which comprise the agenda? Well, we'll continue this discussion in the coming weeks. Until next time, I'm Miles Eversley. Do take care, and thanks for your time.